I always thought I had my life together. At least, that's what I told myself every time I looked in the mirror. My job was going well, I had a circle of friends who were reliable, and I felt like I had a pretty solid grasp on what I wanted. But sometimes, the things we try so hard to control, our family, our relationships, are the things that slip right through our fingers. It all started with my mom. She had this way of making me feel like I wasn't doing enough, no matter how much I did. She'd visit unannounced, always with something to critique. You could be doing more with your career, she'd say. I mean, how many times have you been promoted, exactly? It wasn't even the questions that stung. It was the way she phrased them. Like nothing I did ever measured up. But it wasn't just her. My sister, Karen, was a piece of work too. She'd show up at family gatherings with this fake smile, all sweet and, "How are you?" until she saw an opening. Then she'd drop a comment about how I needed to spend more time with mom, or how I should get a real boyfriend, not just someone who had potential like the guy I was seeing at the time. Every word they spoke felt like a push to be someone else, to live a life that I didn't want, and deep down, I knew it was toxic. But I told myself that family was family. Blood was thicker than water, right? It was after my last argument with mom that things really started to unravel. I had been seeing Chris for almost 6 months by then, and I really liked him. He was stable, kind, easy to talk to. Everything my mom didn't think I deserved. One Sunday, I brought Chris over for dinner. It was supposed to be a quiet evening, but when my mom started asking him about his job, like, seriously prying, I knew things weren't going to end well. I could see the way Chris was getting uncomfortable, shifting in his seat, trying to answer her questions without sounding defensive. "Don't you think it's time for you to think about a more stable career?" Mom asked, her tone casual, but there was an edge to it. I felt the heat rise in my chest, but I bit my tongue. Chris smiled, but I could see the awkwardness building in his eyes. It was that same old thing. The constant pushing, the expectation that everyone around me should fit into a mold that wasn't theirs to begin with. And then, just as I thought the night couldn't get worse, Karen added her 2 cents. "So, when are you going to get serious with him?" "You're not getting any younger," she said, eyeing me like she was inspecting a piece of merchandise. I felt the walls closing in. The conversation spiraled. My mom and sister ganged up on me, subtly accusing me of being too passive in my relationships, questioning my choices, making me feel like I wasn't enough. And all I could think was, why did I let them do this to me? Why did I keep allowing them to make me feel small? After Chris left, things hit me harder than I expected. My mind was racing, and I realized I didn't know when it had all gone wrong, when I had become the kind of person who needed constant approval. Maybe it had been years in the making. Maybe I'd always been trying to please them, trying to live up to expectations I didn't even care about. I called Chris the next day, but he didn't pick up. I left a voicemail, apologizing, but part of me was terrified he wouldn't come back. What if they had driven him away? That's when I felt something snap. It wasn't the fear of losing him. It was the realization that I had been living my life for them, and not for myself. I had been prioritizing their opinions, their judgments, their desires for so long. I didn't know who I was without them. But something in me didn't want that life anymore. It wasn't just Chris, it was everything. I didn't want to keep living in this toxic loop of their expectations, waiting for their approval that would never come. I needed space. I needed clarity. So, I made a decision. I called Karen and told her I needed some time away from the family. I needed to focus on myself. She was furious, of course, accusing me of abandoning everyone. But I stood firm. This time, I wasn't going to let them manipulate me into staying in this unhealthy dynamic. The hardest part was calling Mom. I hadn't been able to do it all day. I kept putting it off, feeling that familiar knot in my stomach. But eventually, I dialed her number, waiting for the moment when I'd have to explain everything. "Mom," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. There was a long pause. I could hear her moving around on the other end of the line, probably folding laundry or doing something mundane. She always sounded busy, as though she were trying to distract herself from the chaos of her own emotions. "What is it now, honey?" she asked, almost dismissively. I need some space. From you and Karen. I'm not going to keep doing this." "What do you mean, space? We're family. We don't just give up on each other." I can't keep living for you. I need to figure out what I want. I'm sorry, but I can't keep doing this. You've got to understand. She didn't say anything for a while, and when she finally spoke, her voice was sharp. I can't believe you do this to us. After everything I've done for you. The guilt flooded me, but I pushed it down. I knew this was for the best. I'm sorry, Mom, but this is my life. I hung up feeling a strange combination of relief and guilt, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel suffocated. It was like a weight had been lifted off my chest. I didn't know what the future would look like, but I knew that I had to start living it for myself, without constantly looking over my shoulder to see if they approved. The next few days were a blur of confusion and clarity all at once. I had taken a bold step by distancing myself from my family, but now, sitting with the quiet aftermath, I wasn't sure if I was brave or just a coward trying to escape. What had started as a desperate plea for space felt like a huge leap into the unknown, and I wasn't sure if I was prepared for the fallout. Karen didn't waste any time. By the end of the week, she had sent me a long message. One of those passive-aggressive ones that tried to sound innocent but just reeked of judgment. It was like a ticking bomb wrapped in sweet words. I had barely read the first few lines before I knew it was exactly what I had expected. Mom and I are really hurt by what you said. It started. I don't know why you think you need to push us away when all we've ever done is try to help you. I just don't understand why you're doing this. I put the phone down, my hands trembling. It wasn't the first time I had gotten one of those messages from her, but this one hit harder. She'd always had a way of making everything seem like my fault. She made me feel like I was selfish for wanting some independence. But I wasn't going to give in. I couldn't. I took a deep breath and decided to leave the message unanswered. There was no point in responding right away. Not yet. I needed time to gather my thoughts and figure out how to stand my ground, because I knew that if I gave them an inch, they'd take a mile. Meanwhile, Chris had been silent too. I understood why. After that awkward dinner, I was sure he was rethinking things, questioning whether it was worth dealing with my family's drama. I tried not to let it consume me, but every time my phone buzzed, I'd pick it up, hoping it was a message from him. But it wasn't. One night, after a long day at work, I decided to call him. I had to hear his voice, even if it was just to apologize for everything. I needed closure, even if I wasn't sure what I was apologizing for exactly. I dialed his number, and after 3 rings, he picked up. Hey, his voice was warm, but there was an edge of uncertainty. How are you doing? I'm good, I said, my voice a little too upbeat for my own liking. How about you? I've been thinking about everything. About that dinner, with your family. I felt a knot in my stomach. I didn't know how to explain the mess that had unfolded, so I just said it plainly. I'm really sorry about what happened. They're not usually like that, I promise. I know it was awkward. It's not that. I get why you're upset with them, but it's hard to see that side of you. I didn't know that's how your family was. His words stung, but I didn't let it show. It's complicated, but I want to figure this out. You and me. I don't want to let my family mess things up for us. There was a pause on the other end, and for a moment, I wondered if he was going to say something that would make everything fall apart. Look, he finally said, I really like you, but I need to know that I'm not just some temporary distraction while you figure things out with them. I don't want to be the one left hanging when you decide to go back to them and make everything better. I felt my heart drop. He was right. I had been so wrapped up in my own family drama that I hadn't been fair to him. I hadn't been fully present for us. He deserved more than that. I understand, I said quietly. I don't want that either. I just need some time to figure out what I want, not just with them, but with myself. I'm not saying I want to walk away from this, but I need to sort things out. Another pause. I could almost hear him weighing his options. I get it, but I'm not going to wait around forever. I know, I replied, my voice barely a whisper. And I wouldn't ask you to. We ended the call shortly after. My heart felt heavy, but it was a relief too. For the first time, I realized that I wasn't just struggling with my family. I was struggling with who I was in their shadow. I needed to stop seeking validation from them. I needed to stop letting their expectations dictate my life. But it wasn't as easy as just deciding to change. It was messy. It was complicated. I knew that the road ahead was going to be tough, especially if I wanted to fix things with Chris. But for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was finally on the path to finding myself. The next week, I decided to take a break. I packed a bag, left a note for my roommate saying I'd be back in a few days, and drove out of town. It wasn't a dramatic escape, but I needed the space. I needed the peace to clear my head. I ended up in a small town a couple of hours away. It was quiet, tucked away from everything I knew, and it felt like the perfect place to just breathe. I spent my days walking by the lake, sitting in quiet cafes, and reading books I hadn't had the chance to finish. I didn't check my phone much. I didn't talk to anyone. I just existed. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was running from something. I felt like I was running towards something, towards the version of myself that had been buried under the weight of my family's expectations. The first night I spent in the town, I realized something. I didn't need to fix everything right away. I didn't need to know the answers. I just needed to live for myself for a while, without the constant noise of others telling me who I should be. It wasn't perfect. I still felt guilty about the way things had ended with Chris. I still felt the pull of my family's judgment. But for once, I felt like I had control. And that was enough for now. I wasn't sure what the future held, but I knew one thing. It would be my future and no one else's. And that thought gave me a little more courage than I'd had in a long time. The days in that small town passed slower than I had imagined. At first, I welcomed the pace. No pressure, no constant reminders of the chaos waiting back home. It felt like I could breathe again. Each morning, I would take a long walk down by the lake, listening to the water gently lap at the shore, letting the silence fill the empty spaces in my mind. It was a simple life, but it was grounding. I'd forgotten how much I needed that kind of peace. As the days wore on, I found myself reflecting on everything. The fight with my family, the tension with Chris, the years I'd spent tangled in a web of expectations. I'd always thought I was strong, always tried to be the one holding everything together, but maybe I had been holding on to the wrong things. My family had been suffocating me, and I had let them. Chris, despite his good intentions, had been a casualty of that same dynamic. I wasn't sure if he'd wait for me to untangle myself, or if he would move on. Part of me hoped he would still be there when I returned, but another part of me knew that I couldn't expect him to put his life on hold. After a week, I got an unexpected text from my mom. The message was short and simple, but I could feel the weight behind it. "I miss you. Please come home. We need to talk." I stared at the screen for a while, unsure of what to do with the emotions it stirred. The old me would have rushed back, wanting to fix things, smooth things over, avoid the confrontation, but I wasn't that person anymore. At least, I didn't want to be. I had made a promise to myself in that small town, to stop living in the shadow of other people's needs and expectations. But that didn't mean I had the answers yet. I wasn't ready to go back, not without more time to think. I put the phone down and decided to call Chris instead. The silence between us had stretched long enough. I needed to hear his voice again, to know where we stood, if we stood anywhere at all. He picked up after the first ring. "Hey," he said, his voice still a little tentative. "Hey," I replied, my words coming out a little shaky. "How have you been?" "Busy, but okay," he answered, then paused. "I've been thinking about you, about us." His words made my stomach twist. It had only been a few weeks, but the distance between us felt much longer. "I know," I said softly. "I've been thinking about us too. I don't want to pressure you, but I need to know where we stand, Kate. I'm not going to wait around indefinitely. I understand that you need time, but I can't be in limbo forever." I felt a pang of guilt. I didn't want to hurt him, but I also didn't want to settle for something half-hearted. I couldn't give him an answer right now, not when I wasn't sure about my own direction. "I understand," I said, my voice catching, "and I don't want to leave you hanging either. I need some more time. I just need to figure out who I am first, what I want." There was a long silence on the other end. I could hear him exhale slowly, and I knew he was processing everything. Finally, he spoke again. "Okay," he said, his voice steady but weary. "I'm not going to ask you for a timeline, but I need to know that this is going somewhere. Because if you don't know what you want, then I can't keep holding on." I knew what he meant. He was asking for certainty, and I couldn't give it to him. Not yet. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of my decision. I don't know, Chris, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. But I can't give you something I don't have right now. I need to find that for myself first. All right, he said, and I could hear the quiet resignation in his tone. I hope you figure it out. But if not, just know that I don't have all the time in the world. I know, I replied, my heart heavy. I'll figure it out. I promise. The call ended with no promises or declarations. There was no resolution, just a fragile understanding that we both needed space. It wasn't easy, but I knew it was necessary. I spent the next few days in silence, not just with Chris, but with everything. My family, my life back home, my own mind. It was hard, like wading through thick fog. There was no clarity, no clear path forward. But there was something else, something that made the uncertainty a little easier to bear. It was the first time in my life that I wasn't trying to please anyone. For the first time, I was making choices that felt true to me, even if they were painful. I couldn't go back to who I was, not after everything that had happened. My family would never change overnight, and I wasn't going to try to force them to. I wasn't going to return to the old dynamic where I was the one who always had to apologize, always had to bear the brunt of their disappointment. I had done that for so long, it had become second nature. But now, I wasn't sure if I could go back to it, even if they begged me to. The night I finally made the decision to return home, I drove through the familiar streets with a sense of finality. The town that had given me space, peace, and clarity now felt like it was in the past. I couldn't stay there forever. I was ready to face the music, ready to tell my family that I wasn't the person they wanted me to be. But more than that, I was ready to face myself, to stop pretending I was okay with things I had never been okay with. As I pulled up to my apartment, I didn't feel relief. I felt something else, something raw and vulnerable. It wasn't the end of my journey, but the beginning of something new. I didn't know what the future held, or if Chris would still be there when I was ready. I didn't know if my family would accept the new version of me, or if they would try to drag me back into their world of expectations. But I was ready to find out. I was ready to see where I could go when I stopped holding myself back. I was ready to live for me, not for anyone else. And no matter what happened, that was enough for now. I had expected a moment of clarity when I returned, a moment where I'd know exactly what to say, how to face the mess I had left behind. But when I walked through the front door of my apartment, everything felt like it was still suspended in the air, unresolved, hovering just out of reach. My heart was pounding, my mind racing with the weight of the decision I had made. The apartment felt different, emptier, almost, as if it too had been waiting for me to come back and make sense of everything. I knew it wasn't just the physical space that had changed. It was me. I was the one who had been away, the one who had spent days grappling with the truth of who I was and what I wanted. And now that I was back, I realized that I didn't have all the answers. The first thing I did was check my phone, though I already knew I'd see the messages from my mom, the text from Chris. I hadn't been able to bring myself to answer them right away. I had given myself the space to breathe and think, but now it was time to face the reality of what I had left behind. There were 5 messages from Chris, all increasingly urgent, and one from my mom that was simple, almost pleading. "Unna, please, let's talk. We need to work this out. I'm not mad, I just need to understand." Unna. I sighed and sank down onto the couch. It felt like the world was pressing down on me. The weight of my mother's words, their desperate attempt at reconciliation, was heavy, and Chris's messages felt like the weight of someone else's expectations. I hadn't asked for any of it. I hadn't asked to be the one everyone turned to when they needed something. I hadn't asked to carry the burden of other people's needs while burying my own. But now, here I was. I stared at the messages for a while before finally texting my mom back. "I'm home. Let's talk. But it needs to be on my terms." It took a few hours for her to respond, but when she did, it was a short reply. "I'll be there in an hour." That was typical of her, direct, to the point, no unnecessary conversation. I knew she wanted to fix things, to explain herself, to somehow patch up the wound she didn't even realize she had caused. When I finally heard the knock on the door, my stomach dropped. I took a deep breath and opened it, finding my mom standing there, her face drawn with concern. She looked the same, but somehow, everything felt different. "Hey, Mom," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hi, sweetie," she said softly, her voice betraying her own nerves. She stepped inside, and we stood there in silence for a moment, unsure of how to begin. "I don't really know where to start," she finally said, sitting down on the couch across from me. "I guess I just want to say that I'm sorry for everything. I know I wasn't there for you the way I should have been." I raised an eyebrow, surprised by the directness of her apology. It wasn't something I had expected. She had always been the one to dismiss my feelings, to brush things off as if they didn't matter. But now, she was admitting that something had gone wrong. That maybe, just maybe, she had played a part in it. "I don't know if I'm ready to forgive you yet," I said, the words feeling more honest than I had expected. "You hurt me, Mom. All those years of not listening to me, of expecting me to fit into your mold, it broke something in me." Her eyes welled up, and I could see the guilt flooding in. But I wasn't about to let her off the hook. "Not yet. I was trying to help you, Kate," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I know it wasn't always the right way, but I didn't know how else to do it. I didn't know how to be the mother you needed me to be." I shook my head, swallowing back the bitterness. "But you never asked me what I needed. You just assumed. And then you made me feel like I wasn't good enough when I didn't meet your expectations." "I didn't realize," she started, her voice faltering. "I never realized how much I was pushing you away, how much I was hurting you." We both fell silent for a moment, the weight of our words settling between us. I wanted to be angry, to yell, to let her know how much damage she had done. But I also knew that this conversation, this messy, painful conversation, was the only way we could move forward. "I need space, Mom," I said finally, my voice soft but firm. "I need to figure out who I am on my own. I need to stop trying to be what everyone else wants me to be. And I can't keep trying to be the person you want me to be if it means losing myself in the process." She nodded slowly, her face a mix of sorrow and acceptance. "I understand," she said quietly. "I don't want to lose you, but I want you to be happy. I want you to be yourself, even if that means I'm not always the person you want me to be." That wasn't an easy thing for her to say. I knew that. My mom had spent so much of her life molding me into the daughter she had dreamed of, and hearing that she was willing to let me go, let me be me, was as freeing as it was painful. "I don't know where we go from here," I said, "but I want us to figure it out, even if it takes time." She smiled through the tears. "We will. I'm not going anywhere, Kate." And just like that, we started to take the first steps toward something different, something more honest. I wasn't sure where it would lead, but for the first time in my life, I felt like I was finally speaking my truth. The next morning, I reached out to Chris. I had put it off long enough, and I knew I needed to talk to him before I got too far into this new version of myself. I didn't expect him to just wait around for me to figure things out, but I needed closure. I needed to understand if there was still a place for us, or if we had both just moved on without realizing it. "Hey," I texted, "can we talk?" It took a few minutes, but he finally responded. "Sure. When?" I set up a time for later that evening, and when the time came, I called him. He picked up on the first ring. "Hey," I said, trying to steady my breathing. "Hey," he replied. "What's up?" I took a deep breath. "I've been thinking a lot, and I don't know what to say. I'm not ready to jump back into anything, and I don't want to keep you waiting." "I get it, Kate," he said, his voice surprisingly calm. "I'm not looking for a quick fix. I just want to know if there's still something here worth fighting for." I swallowed hard. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I don't want to leave things unfinished either." There was a long pause on the other end. "Okay," he said finally. "I think we both need time to figure this out, but I'm still here. Whenever you're ready." I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. The uncertainty wasn't gone, but I felt like I had just taken the first real step toward being honest with both myself and the people I cared about. "Thanks," I said softly. "I'll let you know when I'm ready." With that, I hung up, feeling a little lighter. Things were still up in the air, but for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was on the path towards something real, something that wasn't just about what others wanted from me, but about what I needed for myself. The days after that conversation with Chris were a blur, each one bleeding into the next as I navigated the emotional fallout of everything. It felt like I was standing at the edge of something, just waiting to take that final step, but not knowing if I was ready to fall. The weight of my past, the complicated relationship with my mom, the unresolved tension with Chris, it was all still hovering over me, making it difficult to breathe. I kept thinking about my conversation with my mom. She hadn't said much more after that. The air between us had shifted, but I wasn't sure if it was for the better, or if it was just the calm before another storm. I still didn't trust her completely. She was trying, I could see that, but I couldn't forget how often she had failed me in the past. Even so, there was something different in the way she had spoken, a sincerity in her apology that I hadn't expected. I couldn't deny that I was starting to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time. A flicker of hope, like maybe things could get better, but it wasn't enough to erase the hurt. In the meantime, life had to keep moving forward. I had a job to get to, bills to pay, a life to manage. It felt like everything I did was just a way to numb the space in my head, to keep from spiraling too much. But even with all the distractions, the unresolved questions kept pulling me back. That was when I decided to go to therapy. I had been hesitant for a long time, mostly because I didn't want to confront my feelings. I had convinced myself that I could figure things out on my own. But now, sitting in the quiet of my apartment, with the weight of everything pressing down on me, I realized I couldn't. Not anymore. The first session felt strange, awkward, even. I was sitting across from a woman named Dr. Reynolds, who had the kind of calm demeanor that made me feel both heard and uncomfortable. She didn't say much at first, just let me talk. Let me tell her everything that had happened in the past few months, everything that had been eating away at me for years. At first, it was just a jumble of thoughts. My mom, Chris, the way I had felt trapped in a life that didn't feel like my own. Tell me about your relationship with your mom, Dr. Reynolds had asked after a while. I didn't want to get into it, didn't want to rehash all the bitterness I had buried for so long. But there was no escaping it. I had to confront it if I wanted any chance at moving forward. She never really saw me, I said, my voice quieter than I intended. She saw what she wanted me to be, but never really saw who I was. And how did that make you feel? She prompted gently. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Like I didn't matter. Like I was just a project. Something to fix, to mold into something perfect. I couldn't ever live up to her expectations. And how do you feel about that now? She asked, her voice steady, as if she had been waiting for me to come to this point. I don't know, I admitted. I'm angry. But I also want her to love me for who I am, not for who she thinks I should be. We talked for almost an hour, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like someone was really listening to me. Dr. Reynolds didn't try to fix things for me. She just helped me put everything into perspective, helped me see that I didn't have to carry all of this alone. After the session, I felt emotionally drained but somehow lighter. It wasn't a solution, not by a long shot, but it was a step toward understanding myself, toward making sense of everything I had been running from. I left the building with a strange sense of clarity, and as I walked down the street, I saw Chris's name light up on my phone. I hadn't been expecting him to reach out, but the moment I saw his message, I realized I wasn't sure how to respond. I hadn't given him an answer, not really. Not the kind of answer that would tell him where we stood. He had been patient, which surprised me. He had never been the type to wait around for answers. But here he was, waiting, as though he knew I needed more time to figure things out. And in a way, he was right. I needed space to figure out what I wanted, who I was, and whether there was still room in my life for him. I wasn't sure what that answer would look like, but as I stared at the message, I realized that maybe it didn't have to be a grand declaration. Maybe it could just be a conversation, one step at a time. The message was simple. Understood? I know you're going through a lot right now, and I'm here for you. Whenever you're ready, we can talk. Understood? I felt a weight in my chest at his words, something I couldn't quite place. It wasn't just guilt or regret. It was the realization that I didn't know what to say. I didn't know if I could give him what he wanted, or if I was even ready to try. But I knew I needed to at least talk to him, to face whatever was between us. So I texted back, _, can we meet? I think it's time we talk. Underscore. His reply came almost immediately. Underscore, of course. When and where? Underscore. I set up a time for the following evening at a coffee shop, somewhere neutral, somewhere we could sit and talk without the pressure of being at either of our homes. I didn't know how it would go, but I knew it was time to stop avoiding the inevitable. The next day felt like a countdown. I went through the motions of work, of keeping myself busy, but the whole time I couldn't stop thinking about the conversation I was about to have. Would we find common ground? Or was this the beginning of the end? When I walked into the coffee shop the next evening, I saw Chris sitting at a corner table, his face tense but hopeful. He was staring down at his coffee, tapping his fingers on the mug. He looked up when he heard the door open, and I could see the shift in his eyes when he saw me. It was like he had been holding his breath, just waiting to see if I would show up. "Hey," I said softly, offering him a small smile. "Hey," he replied, standing up to give me a quick hug. "I'm glad you're here." We sat down, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. It was as if we were both trying to figure out where to start. Finally, he spoke. "I've been thinking about us a lot," he said, his voice steady. "I don't know what you need, but I'm willing to give you the time and space to figure it out. I don't want to pressure you, Kate, but I also don't want to lose what we have." I looked at him for a long moment, taking in his words. This was the kind of honesty I had been looking for. It wasn't demanding or desperate. It was just real. "I don't know where we go from here," I said, my voice quiet. "But I think I need to figure out who I am before I can figure out what I want from us." Chris nodded, his eyes soft. "I can respect that. I'll be here when you're ready." The weight of his words hung in the air between us. It wasn't an answer, but it was a start. And for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was moving toward something honest, something true. The following weeks passed by in a blur, a strange combination of uncertainty and clarity. Chris gave me the space I needed, though I could tell he was still holding on to hope. It wasn't the easiest thing for either of us. I had so many unresolved feelings, and each day felt like a new opportunity for me to question myself. But the more I thought, the more I realized that I couldn't keep putting my life on hold, waiting for the right moment, waiting for everything to be perfect. There would never be a perfect moment. My sessions with Dr. Reynolds had been helping, too. Slowly but surely, I was starting to understand why I had been so afraid of being vulnerable, why I kept pushing people away. It wasn't about Chris or my mom. It was about me and my fears. I had spent so much time building walls around myself that I couldn't remember what it felt like to truly let someone in. It was terrifying, but it was also freeing, like I had finally given myself permission to stop living in the past. One night, I sat at my kitchen table, scrolling through old photos on my phone, pictures of my childhood, of moments with my mom when things were simpler, before everything had gone sideways. I hadn't thought about it in years, but as I looked through them, I couldn't help but wonder how things might have been different. What if I had been more open with her? What if she had been different, more present in my life? The questions didn't stop, but for the first time, I didn't feel the overwhelming need to answer them. I didn't need all the answers anymore. I had learned to accept that. It was late when I finally decided to text Chris. I had been putting it off for days, unsure of what to say, but I knew it was time to stop running from the inevitable. My heart was still heavy with the weight of everything, but I couldn't keep pretending like I didn't care. So I typed out a message. "I think it's time we talk again." He replied almost instantly. "I've been waiting for you to say that." We agreed to meet the next day at the same coffee shop, and when I walked in, I saw him sitting at the same corner table. This time, there was no awkward silence between us. No tiptoeing around our feelings. It was different, real. I sat down, and Chris smiled, his eyes soft. "So, where do we go from here?" I took a deep breath, my hands shaking slightly. But for the first time in a long while, I felt sure of my answer. "I think we take it one step at a time," I said, meeting his gaze. "I'm not asking for everything to be perfect right now. I just want to see where this goes. No more hiding. No more pretending I don't care." Chris nodded, his smile widening. "I can do that. We can do that." It felt like a weight lifted from my chest, and even though the future still felt uncertain, something about the moment felt right. The uncertainty didn't feel like a threat anymore. It felt like the beginning of something new. For the first time, I was ready to face whatever came next, no matter how difficult or messy it might be. The next few months weren't perfect. Relationships rarely are. But as I continued therapy, as Chris and I navigated the ups and downs of what we had, something changed within me. I started to trust again, not just him, but myself, and little by little, I let go of the past. It wasn't just about me and Chris. It was about me finally choosing myself, facing my fears, and accepting that I was worthy of love, not just from others, but from myself. When I spoke to my mom again, it was different. We talked, really talked, and for the first time, I felt like I wasn't a project for her to fix. I wasn't a reflection of her mistakes or her expectations. I was just me. And I realized that even if she couldn't fully understand everything I'd been through, that was okay. I had the strength to live my truth, regardless of what anyone else thought. I didn't need to be perfect, and I didn't need anyone's approval to be happy. As I sat across from Chris that evening, holding his hand for the first time without fear or hesitation, I knew this was the start of something real. The future was still uncertain, but it felt lighter now, more possible. We didn't need all the answers. We just needed to be willing to walk forward together, step by step, and let life happen. And for the first time in my life, that was enough.